I grew up rather poor, and so I learned not to ask for what I wanted
Yeah.
because I noticed that not only did I not get it, but my parents seemed depressed for a while about not being able to give it to me. So when my mother asked me what I wanted for my 13th birthday, I said, "Oh, nothing. It doesn't matter." But
Mhm.
my aunt, she asked me what I was interested in. And at that time, I was interested in history.
Mhm.
And in a sense, the 13-year-old version of me was trying to figure out what the hell happened around here. Why is everyone in this neighborhood living as if they'd lost their dreams? That's how it seemed to me. And so my aunt set off to get me a history book. And she was a notoriously short person. So I imagine when she went into the store and said, "Where do I get a history book?" And they pointed to a top shelf. She
You
went over,
pulled from the
she reached
mythology
up and
section.
she took out the mythology book and it was wrapped up, and then she gave it to me. And I love getting a book. And so I tore the paper open and I saw this flying horse and a guy on the horse shooting an arrow. I want this book. And my aunt said, "Oh, it's the
Oh.
wrong book. I got the wrong book." And I said, "No, it's the right book." And so it was the right, wrong book.
Mhm.
It was a gift given by mistake, and yet it was accurate.
Yeah.
And I read this entire book, almost the entire book that night. And it just opened a different world. And I didn't need to have a better education. I didn't need to be older. I didn't need to be bigger. I didn't need to be less poor. I was welcome in that world, boom, right away. And the world was bigger than the world that I was seeing. And
Because you
so,
were in a rough part of town, weren't you? Like it was a
yeah,
bit
yeah.
rough and tough.
Yeah, yeah. And the myths are rough and tough too. There's a lot going on, there's beasts and the ships are getting lost and the sisters of fate are giving everybody, limitations and all this. And to me, it was just a beautiful expansion of the world.
Mhm.
And so I didn't realize it at the time, and there was no one there to confirm it in me, but I had found my field, my world, and my path. And then unfortunately, just as is the case for most young people in the modern world, there's no rite of passage. There's no necessary engaged mentoring going on. So
Mhm.
when I was telling people, including my aunt, how great this was, they just didn't even hear me. And of
Mhm.
course, in school, they didn't want to talk about mythology.
Mhm.
And so then I thought it was a hobby. I
Mhm.
kept my interest in it. I kept reading about it, but I didn't know that it was actually a life path.
Mhm. And you went off to Vietnam too, didn't you?
Well, I didn't go. I was
Ah,
so I got drafted and
ah,
refused to go. And it's a pretty complicated story, but when I got the draft notice,
mm,
I wrote back and I said, it's not a declared war. Near as I can tell, it's not a just war. So I'm not coming. But if you have another war, let me know. And I thought I was being open-minded and courteous. Well, soon came a knock on the door saying, "You either go into the military or you go to jail." And so at that point, and this is interesting because I didn't have the power of my own convictions. My father had been in World War II. All my aunts and uncles had been part of World War II. They all thought I had to go. My entire neighborhood thought I had to go. My friends thought I had to go. When I asked my mother, she said, "Our sons always go."
mm,
And so I just couldn't withstand all of that. So I went. But then in the military, what happened is they started to give me orders that I didn't feel were appropriate. And so my way of being was to say, "Well, I'm not going to do that. Just, I could do that order. Give me another order."
mm.
And so then I got in trouble. And so then I got
That
court-martialed.
doesn't always go over so well in the military. That
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
asking for options.
Yeah. So eventually I got a serious court-martial and was put into a military prison. And
Mm,
what do they do in a military prison? They give you more orders.
mm.
And I said, didn't you get the memo? I'm here because I'm not doing orders. So then they threw me in solitary confinement. And so I was in there for months,
Which
actually.
is a bit of a rite of passage in itself, I'd
It
imagine.
was a it was a underworld rite of passage. I was in the underworld.
Mm,
And in the process of being in there, when I thought they weren't taking me seriously,
mm,
because they kept thinking I was going to give this up. And they kept sending colonels in. The general came in to talk to me. They were all going to convince me and I was going to give it up. Well, I wasn't giving it up. So in order to convince them that I really wasn't part of what they were doing, I stopped eating. And so that went on for months, actually, the solitary confinement and the not eating also. And so I had gone in at maybe 150 pounds. And by the time I got out, I was 87 pounds. I had really almost disappeared. But it became an underworld rite of passage. And in the depths of the darkness of the solitary nature of that cell, what came back to me was myth. And Odysseus and all kinds of characters from myth were showing up and kind of hanging out with me and giving me advice. And so I got to the point where I had to figure out, am I losing my mind or am I finding my mind?
Mm.
And I decided it was healthier to think I was finding my mind. And so the whole mythology thing came back as much more than an interest or a hobby. It came back as a life-saving thing.
So how
And
did you
so
start to find, how did you start to find that, how to put that into the world? Or how did that come about?
how did I what?
You know, as you went through that rite of passage and you realized
Yeah.
the essential nature of myth, but then how, when that kind of experience finished, how did you start to teach about this, or how did it come into the world, and how did you,
What
how
was
did
an
that happen?
interesting that happened? You know, if you think of a rite of passage, there's three phases: the separation,
Yeah.
the ordeals phase, or the liminal phase, the betwixt and between, in which the change of life occurs and the awakening occurs, and then there's the return, typically to be welcomed by a knowing community.
Yeah.
Well, my return was rejection by everybody.
Mm.
For you know, so I was really lost now. I was not in solitary, but I was in solitary.
Mm.
So I started to remember things about stories, and I started to research stuff in mythology about underworld and about coming back. And that led me into studying anthropology and figuring out rites of passage, literally rites of passage stuff. And that led me to studying the old Irish practice of fasting against injustice. And I started to compile these ideas. And then I realized I had to make my own return somehow, and that no one was going to be there welcoming me. It didn't happen. And so I had to find my own way to be welcome in the world, in a sense. And then what's really interesting is a number of years later, when I had the opportunity to imagine how I could help or be helpful to other people,
Bring something
I
back.
started working with street kids. I started working with gang members and street kids. I worked with battle veterans. I worked with war resistors. I worked with refugees, because what I had found was a connection to the people who are not welcome in the world, to the people who are lost, who are struggling, who are rejected or turned into the other.
Mm.
And so then I started an organization to work with people in those situations by using story and myth, and by getting people to tell most the deepest parts of their own story and figure out how that connects to myth, to see that they're actually in a bigger story than they think they are in, because that's what happened to me. I
Mm.
realized I was in a bigger story.
Mm.
I was just one person caught up in a war and then thrown into the underworld. But the bigger story was understanding that you could have an underworld rite of passage, and understanding that to be a grown person, you had to have a rite of passage of some kind, at least on a psychological level. And so then that eventually became, somehow that led me to telling stories. And so I became a storyteller and then writing about it. And that makes you kind of a mythologist. And then it just kept going.
Because the difference between you and other people, maybe, you know, in the variety of people involved in, you know, Jung and Hillman and all, storytellers are a rare breed, aren't they? There's not so many around in a way. Like it's a, it's almost like, you know, out of all the callings, like storytelling is a particular little calling, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and
Well,
then
you
I
know, when I
found,
say little calling, I don't mean that. I mean a
yeah,
peculiar calling.
well, then I kind of complicated it, because so one thing I had learned I began to learn it in that solitary cell
Mm.
was if I'm going to die, I'm going to die in connection to what's meaningful to me. That's, you know, to die on the battlefield in a war that I didn't think was just, that seemed like an abandonment of my own soul. And a greater abandonment would be to kill in circumstances that I thought were unjust. That's why I realized I had to fast my way out of this.
Mm.
But what I then found is that by having nothing in my life, I'm basically skin and bone in a cell by myself 24 hours a day. Well, I found some things that I loved. I found some things that I wanted to live for. I had figured out what I was willing to die for. And then I started to figure out what I wanted to live for. And then it took a while, but eventually I realized that stories are totally compelling to me. They're like X-ray machines. From inside a story, I can see things I could never see otherwise. And I can even help people get into a story and then they see things differently. And so in the meantime, I had an interest in ethnic storytelling is very ethnic, and I'd studied stories from all over the world, you know, just on my own. But then I started listening to stories from music from different cultures while I was studying stories. So now I was mixing stories and music, which actually is an old thing, but I didn't know that.
Mm.
So then I got interested in rhythm and I started playing hand drums.
Mm.
And then I accidentally started working on a rhythm that I was interested in while I was thinking about a story. And what happened is I could see the story. It was like I was in the story.
Mm.
And it totally changed the way I was perceiving stories. And I'd never told a story out of, I've never rehearsed ever.
Mm.
I've been telling stories for 45 years or more, but I've never rehearsed a story.
Mm.
I just tell it like from inside out.
Yeah.
And so now I was performing, telling stories while playing African drums.
Mm.
And that opened all kinds of things because it turns out most people can't resist that. The rhythm drives images into people. Young people can't resist it at all. And most people, and so I could be in any kind of cultural situation or anything. And if you play, there's certain kind of rhythms that are like, they call it light trance. And it's kind of like the video screen actually has a little pattern, and it's a pattern that's compelling. Drum can be even more compelling. And so telling a story while playing a compelling rhythm turns out to be change all the energy in a room. And most people,
And by the way, turns out to be what they actually did in indigenous tribes.
I was rediscovering the old thing
Yeah.
or connected to what you said at the beginning, something old caught up to me.
Mm.
And I was now being in Ireland, it's called a shanachie. In Africa, it's called a griot. In other places, it's called a shaman. It's all related to rhythm and voice and mythic image.
Mm.
And so that became a thing that I do until this day. But then someone asked me to write about it. And so the next thing I was writing books about it also. So then I wound up
Is
through
that
story
the water of
being
life?
yes, being in both the literary world and the oral tradition world. And I've been in both of them for over 40 years now. And sometimes I can't tell which one I'm supposed to be doing. But both of them have been meaningful to me. And so in a funny way, if you track it back to that 13th birthday,
Mm.
that was the beginning of an arc of awakening that
Mm.
continues to this day, that has at its center imagination, mythic imagination, story, and specifically stories that move the soul.